Hi friends, my name is Alex and I hold a PhD in religious studies from the University of California. Now, I'm not Russian by nationality and I wasn't born in Russia, but Russian is actually my native language. And because of that, I often find myself talking with American friends and colleagues about what they think Russia is like. And you know what I've noticed? Most people see Russia through a very narrow lens, almost always through the image of just two big cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg. But why is that? That would be like thinking you understand the United States because you've been to New York City. So let me ask you, when you hear the word Russia, what is the first thing that comes to mind? Maybe it's Moscow or St. Petersburg, right? Maybe it's snow, Orthodox churches with golden domes, or let's be honest, maybe it's even a bear with a balalaika. Those are the classics. But the truth is, Russia is way more complex, diverse, and surprising than most people realize, especially when it comes to religion. And that's exactly what we're going to explore today. Okay, now, be honest. When you picture a typical Russian, who do you see? Most likely a white, Slavic-looking Orthodox Christian, right? But here's the thing. Russia isn't just Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's not just Orthodox Christianity, and it's definitely not just one people. In fact, Russia is one of the most ethnically and religiously diverse countries on the planet. There are about 200 ethnic groups and nationalities living in Russia. Yes, 200. According to the Ministry of Science and Higher Education, over 270 languages and dialects are used across the country, and around 80 of those are languages of indigenous peoples. In Russian schools today, 105 languages are used. 24 of them are used as the primary language of instruction, and 81 more are taught as separate subjects. So let's be clear, millions of Russians are neither Slavic nor Christian, but they're still citizens of Russia. That's why in this video I want to challenge the stereotype of the typical Russian. We'll talk numbers, we'll look at religions and people you've probably never heard of, and we'll explore how most young people in Russia don't actually practice any religion. But first, let's talk geography. Over 70% of Russia's population lives in its European part, which actually makes up only 1/5 of the country's territory. The rest, the massive stretches of Siberia and the Far East, are sparsely populated, but home to dozens of unique peoples with their own tradition, languages, and religious beliefs. Now, just think about these numbers for a second. Almost the entire population of Russia is concentrated in this small part of the country. Meanwhile, take the Far East. The region alone covers over 40% of Russia's total land area. To put that in perspective, that's almost the size of Australia, or twice the size of India. But guess what? Only about 5% of Russia's population lives there. That's under 8 million people. And most of them are mainly packed into a small corner of that giant territory. So why does this matter? Because geography, culture, and religion are deeply connected. The further you go from the big cities, the more diverse and surprising the spiritual map of Russia becomes. And that's exactly what we are going to explore next. Now, let's take a closer look at the religions practiced in Russia today. Yes, Orthodox Christianity is the most widely followed religion. Some polls claim 60-70% are Orthodox, but we'll discuss why it's not the case. And when people think of religion in Russia, they often picture golden domes, churches, and majestic cathedrals. And that's partially true, but it's important to remember that religious life in this land began long before Christianity and long before the word Russia even existed. For example, shamanic traditions have existed here for centuries before Christianization. Among the indigenous people of Siberia and the Altai, there was an entire spiritual network, a kind of ancient internet, made up of connections between people, nature, and the spirit world. Tengriism, practiced by Turkic and Mongolic peoples, isn't just a religion, it's a whole worldview, where the sky, Tengri, is seen as a divine guiding force. There are many indigenous groups across Russia whose beliefs are very far from Christianity. Among the peoples of Siberia and the north, like the Yakuts, Khanty, Nenets, Chukchi, or Udigi, traditional religions include worship of nature spirits, shamanism, and rituals passed down through generations. And let's be clear, shamanism has never disappeared in Russia. One of the most famous scholars of religion, Mircea Eliade, studied shamanic practices in Siberia and Central Asia and wrote extensively about them. And today there are still researchers writing fascinating works on the topic. Of course, modern shamanism has evolved a bit. In the 21st century, shamans from regions like Yakutia, Buryatia, and Tuva are active on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. They perform online rituals, offer virtual consultations, and even take part in international conferences on ethno-healing and spiritual medicine. We're also witnessing a renewed interest in indigenous belief systems, often as part of cultural revival and as a form of resistance against assimilation. In a way, it's a return to pre-Christian roots. That's also why we see the rise of neo-paganism in Russia today. Something similar to what's happening in the Baltic states and Scandinavia. Here's a curious fact about modern Russian shamanism. One shaman from Yakutia actually set out on foot to Moscow with the goal of driving Putin out of the Kremlin. No joke, he was arrested before reaching the city and sent to a psychiatric hospital. The state declared that he lost his mind. But online he became a meme and a kind of symbol of modern spiritual protest. The International Human Rights Organization, Memorial, even declared him a political prisoner. So today more and more people in Siberia are turning back to the rituals of their ancestors. They're reviving clan totems, forging amulets, holding fire ceremonies, and more. And in many cases, if someone falls ill or a family faced serious issues like addiction, people don't go to a doctor, they go to a shaman. And among the peoples of the Russian north, like the Nenets, Yevenki, and Khanty, traditional beliefs like animism, polytheism, and shamanism are still alive. They believe that nature is alive, the spirits dwell in rivers, mountains, animals, and natural forces. They worship multiple gods, each responsible for different aspects of life and the environment. These are mostly nomadic reindeer herding communities where reindeer aren't just a source of food or transportation, but a key part of cultural identity. They have their own languages, songs, folktales, and traditions. And in these cultures, shamans are still seen as mediators between the world of humans and the world of spirits. They perform rituals for healing, predicting the future, and restoring harmony with nature. Some may even compare them to the indigenous people of North America. Now, earlier I mentioned regions like Yakutia, Buryatia, Tuva, Kalmykia, and the Altai Republic. And it's worth highlighting that in many of these areas, Buddhism is actually one of the main religions. Now, I know what you are thinking. Wait, Buddhism in Russia? Most people associate Buddhism with Tibet, Thailand, or Cambodia. But yes, Buddhism is very much alive in Russia, and not just anywhere, but even in the European part of the country. Take Kalmykia, for example. It's the only region in Europe where Buddhism is traditionally practiced. Around 70% of the population there identifies as Buddhist. Pretty wild, right? The Kalmyks are descendants of the Oirats, a Mongolic people who migrated from Central Asia in the 17th century. That's when Buddhism began spreading in the Volga region and Transbaikal area. And today, if you go to Elista, the capital of Kalmykia, you'll find the largest Buddhist temple in Europe, the Golden Abbot of Buddha. It's a stunning complex, and yes, the lamas here hold official titles, just like in Tibet. What's fascinating is that even during the Soviet Union, when religion was heavily suppressed and Buddhist monasteries were being shut down and destroyed, Buddhism managed to survive in these regions. Many temples were destroyed and Buddhist spiritual leaders persecuted and imprisoned. but the traditions never fully disappeared. In places like Buryatia, Tuva, and Altai, Buddhism remains a core part of local culture. These regions are full with temples, and the form of Buddhism practiced here is mostly Tibetan-style Lamaist Buddhism. In Buryatia, Buddhism often coexists side by side with shamanic beliefs, and many local people practice both. In Tuva region, where the majority population consider themselves Buddhists, things go even further. The local religion blends Buddhism, Shamanism, and Tengriism into a unique spiritual worldview. It's truly one of the most fascinating examples of religious syncretism you'll find anywhere. So next time someone shows you what a typical Russian looks like, remember, Russians don't only look like this, but also like this and like this. Russia's spiritual landscape is far more diverse and far more interesting than most people realize. Now, let's talk about Islam in Russia. Islam is actually the second largest religion in Russia after Christianity. There are around 15 million Muslims in the country. That's roughly 10% of the population. Most Muslim majority regions include Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, Chechnya, Dagestan, Ingushetia, and others. In these regions, Islam isn't just a religion, it's deeply woven into the cultural and ethnic identity of the people. And here's a surprising fact: Islam came to this land even earlier than Christianity. Yes, you heard that right. In the year 1922, Islam was officially adopted as the state religion of Volga, Bulgaria, which is now part of modern-day Tatarstan and Bashkortostan. For comparison, the Christianization of Kievan Rus, the moment often considered the birth of Russian Orthodoxy, didn't happen until 988. There is still a historic white mosque in the city of Bulgar in Tatarstan that stands as a symbol of this Islamic heritage. By the way, during the Soviet era, Muslims in the USSR weren't allowed to go on pilgrimage to Mecca. So instead, many from Tatarstan and other regions came to this ancient city in what became known as the Little Hajj. It was their way of honoring the tradition of pilgrimage even under Soviet restrictions. Also, even further south, in the city of Derbent in Dagestan, Arab Muslims arrived in the 7th century. Can you believe this? And by the 8th century, they had already built a mosque. So, in reality, Islam has always been part of this land, and it's an inseparable part of what we now call Russia. But in the West, when people imagine a typical Russian, Islam rarely comes to mind, which is a huge misconception. Even in modern-day Moscow, you'll find one of the largest mosques in Europe, the Moscow Cathedral Mosque, which is 19,000 square meter construction and can hold up to 10,000 people. And today the Muslim population in Russia is growing, not just because of migration from Central Asia, but also due to high birth rates in traditional Muslim communities. Okay, now let's switch gears. Have you ever heard of Russian Amish? Of course, they are not literally Amish, but I'm talking about the Old Believers, a little-known group outside Eastern Europe with a dramatic, rebellious, and inspiring history. It all started in the 17th century when Patriarch Nikon tried to kind of correct Russian Orthodox rituals to better match those of Greek Church. It might sound like small stuff, like crossing yourself with 3 fingers instead of 2, or making slight changes in liturgy, but to thousands of believers, these reforms felt like a betrayal of their true faith. The result? They were persecuted, executed, exiled, but they didn't disappear. Many fled into the taiga, deep in the forest, where some still live today. Some without electricity, without the internet, and following 350-year-old traditions. And over the centuries, some old believer communities migrated even further. Today you can find their descendants not only in Russia and the former USSR, but also in places like Canada, Brazil, and Bolivia. Yes, many of them fled the Soviet Union through China, eventually settling in South America, and they've preserved their way of life ever since. And of course, we shouldn't forget about the Jewish community in Russia. Despite centuries of persecution, first under the Russian Empire and later in the USSR, they survived and preserved their identity. By the late 19th century, the Russian Empire had the largest Jewish population in the world, about 5 million people, or 67% of the global Jewish population at the time. But life wasn't easy. Most Jews were forced to live in the so-called Pale of Settlement, a restricted zone in the western part of the empire. They couldn't settle freely in big cities, and open religious practice was heavily limited. Even so, through all the restrictions, discrimination, and pressure to assimilate, Jewish life and culture endured. But today the Jewish population in Russia has shrunk dramatically. It's estimated at only around 100,000 people. There are also quite a few Protestants and Catholics in Russia, although historically these groups were often seen as foreign influences, even as ideological and political opponents. As I explained in another video, this perception had real political consequences. For example, the Baltic states, where Catholicism and Lutheranism have deep roots, were often treated with suspicion by the Soviet authorities and by the dominant Orthodox Church. Even today, many of these non-traditional groups still face challenges. They are often labeled as sectarians or seen as something alien, as if their faith doesn't quite belong to the Russian religious landscape. Yet, according to the Russian constitution, the country is officially secular. Article 28 guarantees freedom of conscience and religion, including the right to practice any faith or none at all. But in practice, some religions are treated as more legitimate than others. The Russian Orthodox Church holds a special cultural and political status, and laws often reflect that. For example, since 2013, Article 148 of the Criminal Code has criminalized offending the religious feelings of believers. While intended to protect religious sentiment, in practice it tends to shield majority faiths from criticism and doesn't offer the same protection to religious minorities or dissenters. So despite constitutional secularism, the real balance of religious freedom in Russia seems to be uneven. But let's keep going. Today in Russia you'll also find Hare Krishnas, Baha'is, Scientologists, and various other new religious movements, alongside a rising number of esoteric and spiritual practices. As I mentioned earlier, neo-paganism has been gaining popularity in recent years, often as a form of cultural revival, a return to pre-Christian roots. And there is also a very unique phenomenon that defines post-Soviet spirituality, religious syncretism. It means people often combine beliefs from multiple sources. Some might identify as Orthodox or Muslim, but at the same time not believe in hell, believe in reincarnation, fear the evil eye, and occasionally visit an astrologer or a healer. And no, that's not a contradiction. That's just how post-Soviet spirituality works, a mix of traditions, habits, and personal beliefs. So remember, Russia is not just Golden Dome churches and Orthodox iconography. It's a spiritual crossroads, a living, breathing mosaic of beliefs. It's church bells ringing in the countryside, the call to prayer in Tatarstan, Buddhist chants in the temple in Buryatia, a shaman's fire burning in the cold near Yakutsk, an old believer reading psalms in his wooden hut, and a teenager in Moscow saying, "I believe in my own way," or maybe not believing at all. That too is Russia. By the way, of course there are plenty of non-religious people in Russia. I actually talked about that in a separate video, so check that out if you are curious. But let's look at some numbers real quick. Depending on the source, somewhere between 20 to 26% of Russians say they are non-religious or even openly identify as atheists. But here is where it gets really interesting. According to a 2020 survey by the Levada Center, 47% of Russians don't believe in life after death, 48% don't believe in religious miracles, and again, 48% don't believe in things like the evil eye or curses. So essentially nearly half of the adult population in Russia doesn't really believe in anything supernatural. But at the same time, only about a quarter of them actually say, yeah, I'm not religious. So what's going on here? We end up with a strange paradox. Many people call themselves believers, but they don't believe in heaven or hell or miracles or really in anything central to religion. Now, what about younger Russians? If you look at people under the age 26, the picture shifts even more. Only 4% of young people in Russia attend religious services regularly, just 14% pray even once a week. Yet, about 40% of Russian youth identify as Orthodox. And when you zoom out to the general population, 28% of Russians never go to church, mosque, temple, anything. Another 20% do it less than once a year, and 17% more might go once or twice a year at most. Altogether, that means nearly 2/3 of Russians either never or almost never participate in religious life. So what does that tell us? It tells us that for most Russians today, religion is more about culture than it is about personal faith, especially in big cities. Now, you might be thinking, wait, but don't 60 or 70% of Russians say they are Orthodox? Doesn't that make Russia a Christian country? And that's the most important point here. Yes, in surveys, a large majority do say, I'm Orthodox. But only about 4% of them actually live a religious life, going to church, taking communion, observing religious holidays, fasting, etc. And here's the thing, roughly 30% of those who call themselves Orthodox don't even believe in God. Yes, you heard that right. People saying I'm Orthodox while also saying I don't believe in God. So why is that? Because in Russia, for many people, being Orthodox isn't mainly about religion, it's about ethnic and cultural identity. It's like saying, I'm Russian, so I'm Orthodox. The famous phrase of Belarus president comes to mind, who said, I am Orthodox atheist. Even if you don't pray, don't go to church, and don't believe in anything beyond this life, this is sometimes called cultural orthodoxy, and it's not unique to Russia. Just like in Iceland, there are atheist Lutherans, or in Israel, secular Jews. In Russia, Orthodox doesn't always mean religious. Likewise, you find here many cultural Muslims who live secular life, but due to their ethnicity consider themselves Muslims. And understanding that is key to understanding modern Russia. So the next time you hear someone say 70% of Russians are Orthodox Christians, it's worth asking. Are we talking about actual religious practice here, or are we really just talking about cultural identity? That's why I shared all those stats earlier about belief in the afterlife, prayer, miracles, and so on, because once you look closer, you realize the number of truly religious people in Russia, in the traditional sense, is much smaller than you might think. But you know, the biggest idea behind this video isn't just about religion itself, it's about something deeper, the incredible cultural and spiritual diversity that exists inside Russia. Just look at this, all these people, they are all citizens of Russia, millions of them. They have different names, different languages, different traditions, food, clothing, and of course different spiritual lives. Because even today, in the age of internet, TikTok, and global culture, there is still a very persistent myth out there that Russia is one religion, one culture, one people, but that's just not true. In reality, Russia is a mosaic. It's massive, complex, and layered. Outside of Russia, people often find it hard to believe that someone with an Asian face can also be from Russia, or that mountain-dwelling pagan from the Caucasus or Tibetan-style Buddhist from southern Siberia is just as much a part of Russia as someone from downtown Moscow. But that's the reality. So next time you hear someone say a Russian religion, it's always worth asking, which one are you talking about? Because this country is full of voices, full of cultures, and full of different paths to spirituality. Thank you for watching till the end. And thank you to those who support me with donations and through Patreon. I wish everyone peace and health wherever you are.